Uh, Please turn to Philippians chapter 4, verses 2 to 3. That'll be our main text. I'm going to apologize in advance. If I don't have these on, this is blurry. If I have them on, you guys are blurry. So I'll be taking them on. And we'll talk about what happens when we disagree. Whenever I do sermons, I always hate the title just because it never fully captures it. But before we do that, let's go talk about the background of where we got, how we got to where we got. Acts chapter 16, Paul, he had seized this vision, this Macedonian who says, come over and preach the gospel. And so he does. And we see in Acts 16, when he does, he comes over and he preaches the gospel. Verse 14, one who heard this was a woman named Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple goods, who was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul. And after she was baptized, in her household as well, she urged us on, saying, if you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay. And she prevailed upon us. So he goes to Philippi, preaches the gospel. He's already converted some people. And at the end, right, we have the incident with the jailer and whatnot. In verse 40, he says, so they went out of prison and visited Lydia. And when they had seen the brothers, they encouraged them and departed. So there's already these group of people, and they're gathering together in Lydia's house. A few years later, he's in prison. Philippians chapter 1, right? And so he's writing the Philippian church, and it's mostly good things, right? Until we get to chapter 4, there's a bunch of positive things. But he's describing his situation. And there he's saying that he's preaching the gospel, and lots of people are hearing it, even people in Caesar's household. But he's having, and other brethren are becoming more confident and speaking more boldly. But then there's some who are preaching the gospel, and they're doing it just to make his life more difficult. And so I mention this because you can imagine here's Paul. He's in some difficult situation. He's in prison. He's preaching, and he has people who are also preaching who are making his life more difficult, and he doesn't concern about that. As long as the gospel is preached, that's a great thing. That's a wonderful thing. Fine, let it happen. But here we have friends of his, team members of his, who are in a situation where they're arguing. And I can imagine him thinking, this is not good. You're undoing my work. And if we want to look at it, we'll just kind of maybe talk about what type of disagreement this is. We're not given any anything specific. My version of choice, New American Standards, describes them as living in harmony. Just about every other version I came across would just say agree in the Lord. And there's this concept of maybe there's a bit of doctrine or something that they're disagreeing with. But let's go through and what are the things that maybe they're disagreeing about. Could it be false doctrine? I don't think so, because Paul was not shy about calling out if someone was teaching something false. You don't have to turn to this 1 Timothy 1:20, where he talks about Alexander and Hymenaeus. He names names and says they're teaching something that's false and upsetting people. Is it immorality? I don't think so. Again, he was not shy of calling out those who are engaged in immorality. In 1 Corinthians 5:1, he describes that situation there, and he's very blunt, very specific. Is it a case where one of those two sisters had sinned against the other? I don't think so. We have Jesus tells us himself. Let's turn over to that. I'm going to spend a little time on that, of what to do when that's the case. Matthew chapter 18. And verse 15 says, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault, between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. So we see in the scripture that we're going to get into, that's not laid out. So it must not be where one of the sisters has sinned against the other one, or else he could just point back to what Jesus has said. Having said that, this must be problematic enough for him to address, to call them out by name and saying, hey, look, you need to fix this. Have you ever been in a room with two people who had an intense disagreement and you just felt the tension in the air? Like you could just like cut it with a knife, it seemed like almost. Like not a fun situation. And this is why I go back and mention those verses with Lydia. I can imagine that they're meeting in some sort of household, right? Probably a lot smaller than this. Who knows how many people there are, but they're all together. They're hearing this letter being read, and you can imagine that people, as they gather together every Lord's Day to come together to worship, here's Euodia, here's Syntyche, and they're having this disagreement, and yet people are supposed to be focusing on worshiping God, but yet there's this tension, right? And there's this chance probably for us to fester. Maybe people are taking sides. Maybe someone saying, I see Syntyche's point, I see Euodia's point. We see that in 1 Corinthians, right? Where there's those factions that are evolving. So you have a situation where it doesn't seem to be false doctrine, any immorality, anyone that sinned against another, but there's this potential to lead to something that is not good, that's worse. And so I'll take us through, I think, some steps that we see what Paul does with them. So the first part is, notice he doesn't take sides. He says, I entreat Euodia and I entreat Syntyche. Those of us who are blessed with more than one child, I'm sure have experienced something like this, where we have our children come up to us and they're arguing, they're like, no, someone did this and they did that, and you're like, you realize that whatever the argument about is just petty and nonsense and not worth the time, right? And so what do you do as a parent? You say, I'm not interested, I'm not listening, I'm not going to sit there and figure out who started it, I'm ending it. And so I see that with him, just saying, you know what, Euodia, Syntyche, whatever the argument was, it's petty, it's nonsense, it just needs to stop. So not taking sides, calling them out. And then, but he calls them to, he says, to agree in the Lord. And again, New American Standard has living in harmony, but just about everything else talks about whatever it is, there's a disagreement in the mind of how they approach things, or disagreement on an idea. But he goes back to that source of that bond, right? Be in agreement in the Lord, and focusing on Jesus, right? Because that's the source of doctrine. That's the source of their relationship together. That they're both blood bought by Christ. They're both Christians, and so focusing them back on a commonality. But sometimes that's not enough, right? That's Jesus is not there sitting next to us, right? It's kind of sometimes hard to think about it. So he goes to another step. And he calls out, he says, yes, I ask you also, true companion. You may have a footnote in there, and there is an alternate reading that says loyal Syzygus. And so potentially he's calling to a specific person, this Syzygus. And I would say he's using a dad joke, but he's not a dad, but he's kind of made a pun, a play on words. And here's this brother Syzygus here, who he's asking them to meditate on them. Now, I imagine, again, they're together, they're in this room, this house, they're worshiping together. I'm sure having both of them just called out in this letter publicly probably, helped to increase the tension. So maybe Paul's telling this little joke, right? In homiletics, the study of how to prepare and deliver a sermon, they say, occasionally you don't want to just stand there and just say jokes all the time. And occasionally just a little bit of levity might help diffuse the situation and bring home a point. So I could see Paul standing, or, Paul's writing this, and he's like, I'm just going to tell this little joke here, and kind of poor Syzygus, when he hears it, he rolls his eyes, he's like, I've heard this before. But whatever it is, even if it isn't Syzygus, he's calling for someone who's saying, you mediate between these two factions, these two people here. And so for that to happen, it must be someone that both respect, that both say, this person, this Syzygus, is going to give me a fair hearing, that they may not agree with me totally, but I know they care about me, I know they love me, I know that they're willing to listen to my concerns, and that whatever they come up with, that it's going to be the right choice. And I may not be totally happy with it. I can live with it. Um, Paul makes his point when he's when he writes the First Corinthians, and they're disagreeing and they're taking one another to court. And he says, "Is there not one wise person? Is not one wise man among you who can mediate between you?" And so Syzygus here, his loyal companion, seems to be that one wise person. But it's not just that. That's not enough. He tells them, he says, help these women. And then he reminds them of their relationship to him, right? He calls them, he says, who've labored side by side with me in the gospel together. Turn with me, if you will, to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. And what we have here is Paul recounting, when he's defending his apostleship, he's recounting some of the difficulties that he goes through. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, start at verse 25. It says, 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked, which this happened before the shipwreck that is described in the book of Acts. So a night and day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. Now, when I read this, like sometimes I just slip into just thinking that's Paul. But if you go through and you read the book of Acts, you read his letters at the very beginning, at the very end, he's not alone while he's going through this. He has others, he has companions that are with him, and maybe they don't go through every single thing that he goes through, but all these things that I just described, excuse me, they've gone through it as well, or at least a part of it. And so what I see Paul doing here when he reminds them of this is he's saying, hey, sisters, focus back to all those hardships, these common labors that we've done together, um, these difficulties that we've had together. And when you think about that, and when you think about someone that you've had difficulties with, but you think, oh yeah, they were there at my side, they went through this and they did that, or we had this in common, right? It just binds them together. And not just with Paul, but he reminds them again of the rest, together with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers. So he reminds them that, hey, look, both of you, you're part of a team. And we've undergone a lot of difficulties. And not just the difficulties, I'm focusing on that, but also the victories, right? Sharing the gospel, having people respond to that gospel message, seeing lives changed because of Christ, and them being so instrumental in that because of them helping to share that message. And so the idea being both of them looking together and realizing how much more they have in common together. And that's just something that could play out with us, right? Maybe there's a brother that we have a disagreement with, but we remember, you know, he's always there when we need someone to lead singing. We can always count on him to volunteer. I remember when the winter winds come and they knock down my fence, he was the first person there to help put it back up. Or some sister says something that annoys us, we remember she's always there teaching in class. Or when someone passes away, she's always there making food to help with that family. And so all of these good things that we can draw on serves as a well, if you will, of goodwill. That when we have these difficult encounters with people, when we have these disagreements, we reflect on all of that. The thing is, that doesn't come easy. That this comes over time. It involves us interacting with one another. I dare say more so than outside of just worship service, outside of these 4 walls. That we're a part of our lives, where we're interacting with each other and helping each other out and being there. And so what Paul is doing in this situation is reminding them of those experiences for them, that they can go back and think, oh wow, right, I remember the time that Cynthia shared her food when we were over there practically starving, and I'm just going there. and getting by. And then lastly, he mentions here that their names are in the book of life. And um, I've had to reflect on that a bit. I was like, okay, why the book of life? You know, when Paul's writing this out, he's very deliberate in his choices of why he writes what he writes. We live in an age that I can dash off an email and it's no big deal, right? And I don't have to put a lot of thought into it. Obviously, something like this is more important. So why is he choosing that? Um, and I'll give you my think so's, and you can kind of meditate on that and think on that. Turn over to Revelation chapter 13. We come across the book of life is mentioned just a few times, mostly in the book of Revelation. But in Revelation 13, verse 8, he says, and all who dwell on earth worship it, everyone together who has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life. So we see that whatever was written before the world began. And then again, Revelation 17, verse 8 says, then the beast that you saw was and is not and is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the dwellers on earth whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world will marvel to see the beast. So why mention it here in Philippians? Why call them to this? I think what he's doing is referring to them something that's not a relationship that's not temporal, right? He's not referring to them, hey, you have this relationship because you're members of the same congregation, or because you were together part of this team that went out and spread the gospel. He's saying your names were written, both of them, in the book of life. And there's a connection there that is outside of time. And if you think about that, by writing this, I imagine Paul is just getting him to think about the eternal. Now, I'm really bad at this, but there are times that I think about problems and I was like, oh, this problem that I'm about to face or I'm going through, it's just so insurmountable. It's such a big issue. And then given hindsight, you think, you know what? That wasn't such a big deal. That I worried about this far more than I should have. And I was wrong too. And what I like to think he's doing is by reminding them of the eternal, getting them to think about whatever this issue is that they're at loggerheads, that they're just fighting against each other about, that they think, you know, if we step back and put this in perspective for the eternal, this is not such a big deal. And that maybe our problems aren't as serious. In a moment, we'll have an invitation song, but I want to leave you with these thoughts. For those of us who are Christians, right, the first thought that comes to us is like, oh, I wonder what happened with Syntyche and Euodia. Like, did they resolve their differences, right? Wouldn't it have been great if we had a Philippians 2 and found out what the end result is? Fair questions. I would suggest, though, the real question that we should ask is, am I Syntyche? Am I Euodia? Is there something where I'm struggling with someone? You may think, okay, I am, but Owen, you don't know what you're talking about. This is different. This is something that's more serious. And maybe that is. It's a lot of things I don't know about. But I would ask that maybe sometimes we're not the best judge of what something is important or not. So I would encourage each and every one of us to reflect and think, am I in that situation? And if I am, what am I going to do about it? The other thing is, if I have a chance to be a Sisychus, if I have a chance to be that one wise person, to be able to mediate between people and to help build those bridges, try to do that. For those who are not Christians, I can imagine this isn't a very encouraging lesson, right? Why come forward, right? You spend all this time talking about conflict. We're called out of the world to be a family, to be together, from whatever background that we have, all the various backgrounds that we have. And I don't know about you, but the sharpest disagreements that we have are those with those who are closest to us, right? And so as we're part of a family, we're going to kind of clash from time to time. It takes maturity to to grow from that. And so when you put on Christ, when you're baptized into Christ, when you're baptized into the body, you've got a whole new family that we need to learn to work together with. John tells us, right, to love God is to love his people. To be in fellowship with God is to be in fellowship with his people. And that's not easy sometimes, but as I've learned in life, the things that are difficult in life are the things that are worth it, right? That if it's easy and simple to do, probably not that important. And so it's a struggle, but I encourage you, right, eyes wide open, make that choice, because there's no other better choice that you can do than to be added to the body. So I leave you with those thoughts. If you're any way encouraged, any way of need of encouragement or prayers or whatever, make that known as together we stand and as we sing.